Hello everyone, this is KK Sanders and I'll be doing my historical movement presentation on Marcus Garvey. So first, I wanted to show you guys a little timeline about Garvey's life and what he did, the things that he went through and everything. So starting in 1887, Garvey was born in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica, around near the year 1900, so probably around the age of 13 years old. He began his first job as an apprentice at his godfather's printing business. He moved on to publish the Garvey Watchman paper, which was failed after the third issue. In 1912, Garvey moved to London, where he studied at Birkbeck College. Later, about 2 years later, he founded the UNIA, which is the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And then a few years after that, he moved to New York in Harlem, where he had his headquarters for that association, and actually went on a speaking tour around the states. In 1918, that's when he first published the Negro World, which was a newspaper that pretty much had some success, and what he's most known for. And so 2 years after that, he actually created the Negro Factories Corporation, and he got that up and running, and that ultimately helped him get a mailing line, which resulted in him doing some fraudulent things through the mailing line, and he got sentenced to 5 years in prison and around 1922. So then 1923, that's when his trial first began, and UNIA actually closed. So 1927, Garvey was released from prison, and then he continued to try to create more newspapers, and publish more newspapers, and that ended after a few years. And then around 1935, he relocated to London, and he ended up passing there around 1940. So a little bit about Garvey's background. So as I mentioned earlier, he was born in Jamaica. He studied in Jamaica until about age 14, and then after that he was pretty much self-taught. His dad had a library where he liked to read a lot of books and educate himself there. A lot of people call him the Black Moses because of all of the things that he did with the influence that he had. He was a politician, activist, publisher, journalist, entrepreneur. He was many things. And as I also mentioned earlier, he was incarcerated for 5 years for committing a fraudulent crime. And he also had a wife and 2 sons. So Garvey's contributions to adult education. So Garvey was really outspoken and educated. As I mentioned earlier, he founded the UNIA, and with this association, he was able to create a movement where he would influence blacks to work toward building their own government. He taught African American adults how to unify and come together to build something that he thought would better their lives, during this tough time. Many of his actions led to some of the concepts we learned about in education today, such as Black nationalism and Black pride. As I mentioned earlier, again, he published the Negro World newspaper, where he would convey his message, and get it out to the public through the printing press. And by having this amount of influence on African American adults, he was able to maximize his Pan-African philosophy, and that ultimately led to the global movement, which people know as Garveyism. So, with all of that, and him building his factory corporation, he pretty much influenced many adults. You know, everybody kind of looked at him as a person to be like at that time, which leads me to talk about his influence, which he influenced people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Nelson Mandela and others who led the civil rights movement. You know, Garvey wanted to reunite black people in Africa, and his goal was to create a separate nation where black people were economically independent. And, you know, many people followed his influence while others disagreed with his controversial ideas. And through all of that, he still continued to uplift African Americans and encourage them to take pride in themselves and their race. And for that, he will be remembered. And here are my sources.